Happy Saturday, folks. Well, today, while we're waiting on parts for our other projects, we're waiting on our turbo hoses to come in for our Buick Grand National. They were supposed to be here yesterday, but they're still in the post office land on their way. We're waiting for our EFI system to come in for Glenn's 350 Pontiac Stroker that's being built. You can see that on some of our other videos. But with that being said, I want to do this video about a carburetor versus throttle body fuel injection versus multi-port fuel injection. And I want to do a poll at the end of this video, and I would like to see what everybody prefers, what they like. In the comments, if you want to comment, I like this versus that, tell me why. So let me first start off with the carburetors. Now, again, what we're talking about is in the realm of our older muscle cars or any older car. It could be like your 50s cars, even some of your 40s cars that have had retrofit with a small block or something put in it. But muscle car era, a lot of your legacy style engines, small block Chevy, small block Ford, small block Mopar, big block Chrysler, Ford, Chevy, Pontiacs, Buicks, Oldsmobiles. So it's interesting, I follow Jamie at Dead Dodge Garage, and he does great work. And I'm following one of his older videos. He did basically an outstanding build on a 1971 Dodge Challenger, and he installed a Gen 3 Hemi, and it was fantastic the way he approached that. But he does all kinds of other things too, and he really likes the Edelbrock carburetors. And I like Edelbrock carburetors too. I think they're great. And Jamie and I were talking about some things, and it's okay to agree to disagree. And, it was fun just having a little conversation, but there's nothing to get in an argument about on stupid fuel injection versus a carburetor, okay? But let's start off with the carburetor. Now, here's a good example of what we would use a carburetor on. This is Kevin's 1970 Dodge Dart Swinger. This is a 340. It's actually a 416. It's been stroked, and it has a Hughes cam and ported J heads and a 4-speed, and one of those horrible ignition systems that another guy, somebody's uncle that really hates these ignition systems, called Pertronics. I've installed them on I don't know how many cars. Probably first started putting them on back in 2016 or 17, and they're still running like champs. But I digress. This is the Edelbrock, one of their later ones right here. I think it's 1613S, is that what that says? I believe this one's a 650. This thing runs like a champ. Now, when we talk about these carburetors, there's basically, everybody knows the two big players in the game. It's Edelbrock versus Holley. Now, I'm going to agree with Jamie. I think as far as a street car goes, especially in this setup, this Edelbrock is probably my favorite street carburetor. I would agree with him. I would prefer this on a street car. They're very well mannered, and this engine is very well mannered with this carburetor. It has a pretty radical, I wouldn't say too radical, but it's a cam that's, it's there. Now, if I'm drag racing, like with our Barracuda, before we went with the new project, the new direction we're going, we had a 408 small block with a quick fuel 4150. If you're drag racing, I'm going to say I prefer the Holley because of the ease of tunability. Not that you can't tune this. If you want to see how to tune one of these carburetors, go watch Jamie at Dead Dodge Garage. He does. He really knows how to tune these things really well. And there's a lot of other folks too. Jamie knows how to tune these really well. I would say, like with the Holleys, my good friend Joe Williams, as long as many other people too, but he's one of my good friends and who I follow as far as the drag racing thing goes. He drag races a 68 Barracuda fastback with a big block, and he runs a Holley 4150 style carburetor, and he knows how to get them dialed in. He runs a really fast, nice bracket car. I think it runs low sixes. But that's the carburetor side of this. Again, Edelbrock and Holley, if it's a street car that you just want to go in and drive, then these are the carburetors. Now, here is where it gets into carburetor versus TBI EFI. So most of our customers here are folks that are retired, they're older, they finally bought that muscle car that they've always wanted, and it sits in a garage, it sits in a shop, and they travel and they come back and they want to turn the key and they want to start the car. Now, we all know that the fuel is not what it was back in 1968 or 1970. We really have crappy fuel, in my opinion, compared to what they had back then. They had ethyl, and I would say their lowest grade octane fuel. I could be wrong, but it's probably what our very best fuel is today. I think the old ethyl was like 100 octane and it was lead. It was, as far as an engine, making an engine happy, it was as good as it gets as far as a street engine goes. Some of those muscle car engines had 12 or even 13-to-1 compression, looking at the old max wedges. But here's the problem with today's fuel. You go out to start the car, it's been sitting up for 2 weeks, and you crank and you crank and you crank on this thing, and there's no fuel in this carburetor because it's already dried up in the bowls. That fuel has evaporated. Not to mention, that needle and seat, there's a residue on that needle and seat. So now you got a problem with needle and seat and float sticking. Now, I've also seen it on my Barracuda. I don't care what anybody says, as far as my experience goes, that ethyl fuel will attack the butyl rubber on your diaphragm on the mechanical fuel pump. I put fuel pumps on, I can't tell you how many mechanical fuel pumps I've had to replace. They didn't last that long on small block Chevys, small block Chryslers, Fords, because they ate the ethanol would attack the butyl rubber in the mechanical fuel pump. So there's a remedy for that. Now this is where we're going to get into our throttle body fuel injection. You see the real popular ones. The most popular one is the Holley Sniper EFI systems, and that's the one I'm most fond of. However, there's also FiTech. They are very good systems. If you look back at our video we did about a couple weeks ago, maybe a month ago, on our friend Mike McKinney's 1940 Ford, has a small block Chevy stroker in it, and it has a FiTech system in it. Now, this is a Holley Sniper EFI. Now, I know Jamie doesn't like these, and again, Jamie and I can agree to disagree. He's a great guy, and he has very valid points on what he does. He just doesn't like these, and that's fine. I love them. So this unit's been on my car since the year 2019. So this is just to recap, it's a 440 stroke to a 512, solid roller, Indy Max wedge heads, Harlan Sharp rockers, and the Mopar M1 intake. So I'm not going to get into all the engine details and bore everybody. But the Sniper EFI replaced an AED 1000 CFM 4150 style carburetor. That AEM carburetor was a great carburetor. I think they're fantastic, and I think quick fuels are fantastic, and I think a lot of the HP series Holleys are fantastic. They're great carburetors. But I did not have the time to go out and start this car that often, and the same thing would happen. I would have to sit here and pour fuel in it, and this thing would run with the cam that's in it. You know, I would dial it in. Yes, I know how to dial in a carburetor with the vacuum gauge and a screwdriver and a timing light, okay? So this thing, I followed the directions to the T, and it has been so reliable and so nice, and the way it basically tamed the engine down. Now, I'm not going to sit here and tell you that if you put this thing on a dyno that this Sniper is going to make the same amount of horsepower as that 4150, 1000 CFM, or even if you put a small, maybe a Dominator on it. Guys know how to tune it. If it was tuned on a dyno, sure, I'm sure it would make more horsepower, peak horsepower. But in the lower RPMs, I'm sorry, this EFI is so smooth, and it has the torque comes on at such a low RPM and efficient that there was no comparison. And I want to add something else to this. When it gets cold, when I had that carburetor on here, this thing did not like to start and run. And everybody that's had a big block, I don't care if it's a big block Chevy, a big block Ford, a big block Mopar, the bigger they are, when it's cold out, they are cold
natured. And those carburetors didn't have a choke. That AEM, it's hard to find a choke on your bigger carburetors because basically they're made for high performance and for racing. Yeah, you can get a choke, I guess, on an 850, and maybe that could have been set up better. I don't know, but this thing it was just horrible. And we did a video on our Facebook page. This was before our YouTube channel really kind of got started. But about 2 years ago, we had another customer, a 68 Charger with a 489 big block with the same EFI system. That day, it was in January, and it was 18 degrees outside, and I did a video. I went and started Johnny's blue 68 Charger with the 489 stroker big block, and it fired right up, went into high idle, did everything it was supposed to do, and it ran flawlessly. Then I came over to this car within about 20 minutes to see what this one would do. It did the same thing. It started right up and it ran flawlessly. Now, these things get a bad rap from a lot of people. I'm not talking about Jamie when I talk about this. I'm talking about when you see them on Facebook, the people that hate them. I'm going to tell you what I see is those are people that did not follow the directions and did not set them up properly. Now, I'm not going to sit here and tell you that every single one of these is perfect and there's no problems. Sure, there are some problems with some of these. But Holley has, for me anyway, good customer service, and you send it back to them, they'll fix it, and you're good to go. Now, I'm going to tell you, this right here is probably my favorite setup, and we have installed so many of these on Chevelles, 55 Chevys, Mustangs, Chargers, Roadrunners, I believe maybe even some an Oldsmobile. Well, we got a Pontiac that's getting one right now. You're going to see that on a later video once we get the Sniper EFI system for that. So, as far as cost effectiveness, this is a step up from our carburetor. Our carburetor like that, I think you're going to spend probably for that Edelbrock probably in the $600 range. I'm going to guess $500-600 range. It could be. I hadn't bought a carburetor in a good while. A Holley $650, $750, probably going to spend $700. Now, I am going to tell you, I agree with Jamie on one thing here. I agree with Jamie on a lot of things, and as well as Joe and everything. But I hate Holley 600s with the stupid transfer tube. I haven't seen many of those that didn't leak. I hate those things with a passion. They're horrible. That's just, anytime one comes in like, oh my God, I got to deal with that stupid transfer tube. Because those old O-rings on that transfer tube end up leaking. Ugh. But, again, I digress. So we're talking about a $700 average between Edelbrock and a Holley. Now, when we do a TBI system like this, I highly recommend, if it's at all possible, you buy the EFI fuel system that goes with it. And what I mean by that is, Holley, and you can get it with FiTech too, I'm sure, go through Tanks Incorporated, but you want the factory style fuel tank with the fuel pump inside the tank. And there's a reason for that. When you try to run an external fuel pump and it's not gravity fed, it's not made to suck like a mechanical fuel pump. It's made to push. And if that electric fuel pump is above the fuel tank, that fuel pump is going to be short-lived. Ask me how I know. So that is another thing in the cost that you've got to take into account. Now, if you've got something set up where you have a fuel cell in your trunk, and then it's gravity fed to an external pump, that's fine. It'll work just fine, just like guys that race their cars. But if you don't want to listen to a loud fuel pump, then, I highly recommend, going to the EFI fuel tank setup. Now, let's go to cost. The EFI system on a Holley Sniper is probably about, I think maybe $1,400, $1,200, I can't remember, for one of these units. They have a Sniper 2 out that's far superior to this. I would love to have the Sniper 2. It is really nice. It has basically an in and out module, an IO module, and it makes it much easier to hook up, and it's actually programmable.
You can interface it in with your transmissions and everything and control through your TPS. It's very slick. So maybe I'll get one day to put on this. Another thing this has is timing control from Holley. That is a really nice setup, but that's not really talking about the EFI. So the EFI fuel tank, I want to say that EFI fuel tank with the fuel pump, when you buy it from Holley, which is basically they get it from Tanks Inc., I want to say that's in the $600 range for that. So you're talking about, let's say $1,400 plus, you're probably talking about $2,200, $2,300. I'm just putting rough estimates out there. So I would say you got to figure that in. $700 versus $2,200, $2,300 maybe. That's where you're probably at, stepping up. But again, I can tell a huge difference when I go from a carburetor to an EFI. All right, now let's go to multi-port fuel injection. Now, I am very inexperienced with multi-port fuel injection. I'm just going to tell you that right now. So this is our Gen 3 Hemi stroker. I built this, my very first one, so I have no idea what this thing's going to do. However, we're going to talk about multi-port. Now, multi-port being that we have a fuel injector for each cylinder, okay? And you have a throttle body. This throttle body is nothing more than an air door. That's all it is. This is no different than when you see the Holley TBI where the intake goes to the front. It still has a throttle body up here. It still runs the same. So I elected to have this because I like to have an air cleaner and I want to look, well, I know it's not going to look stock, but I just kind of wanted to look this way. But the other one looks fantastic too. Now, multi-port, you're going to have to buy injectors. Well, first of all, you're going to have an intake that will accommodate your injectors, okay? And then you're going to have a throttle body, and then you're going to have the fuel rails. And then on top of that, you're going to have the computer that tells this thing when to fire. Now, obviously, you got your Holley Terminator, which is what we're going to do with this. You have a Mega Squirt. That's a big one. You know, there's other ones. I can't think of all of them. I know a guy back in Texas that has a Mega Squirt. I think the Mega Squirts and like your Dominators, they're for guys that are adding two steps. They're adding multiple nitrous systems. They're controlling boost. They're controlling a multitude of things. In other words, it's several inputs and outputs. It's all kinds of different things that they'll do. Now, this is going to get much more expensive than the TBI. So being on this is, your LSs, those guys and Hemis, you can run the factory intake on one of these, newer or Coyotes. They can run the factory intake and run them just fine. But you still have to have a computer to run that. So I'm going to guess, if you're running an LS or a Hemi, you're probably going to get that intake. Probably, I'm just going to guess the intake by itself that accommodates the injectors are probably maybe $600, $700, maybe they're more. Then you got to buy these. These are a couple $100 here. And then I think on these injectors, I think I paid $600 or $700 for these injectors. And I know, guys, you're going to tell me, did you get this one? You could have got that. I always get, you could have got this for that. I'm just trying to compare things right now. So I'm just going to say over what that is, a TBI, you're probably looking at another $2,000 to go with a multi-port. Now, this is a Gen 3 Hemi, just like with an LS or a Coyote. You can do a multi-port fuel injection system on your legacy engines. Now, if you look at this intake manifold on this big block Chrysler, it has bosses set up to drill. If you want to go multi-port, it's set up to do that. Big block and small block Chevys, you can buy an intake manifold for those that are already drilled, come with the injectors and the fuel logs. So Fords, I'm sure you can probably do the same thing. Small block Chrysler, all you have to do is drill these and set them up to run a multi-port fuel injection. But you're still going to have to run something like a Terminator or a computer system to run that setup. It's probably much more tunable, and man, I would love to build one. There's all kinds of things I would love to build. I just don't have the time for that. For this application, I love the Sniper. Now, what I'd like to know from you guys, it had a lot of your hot rods make a lot more power than mine, I'm sure. But I'd like to know what your thoughts are on carburetor versus
a TBI versus a multiport. Now, on our Grand National, this is called a sequential fuel injection. Now, I won't get into I'm not the expert on sequential versus batch fire versus tuned port, but what I can tell you in my experience was in the 80s, and especially the late 1980s, like your 5.0 Mustangs, and to even some part your tuned port injection Camaros and Firebirds, EFI changed the game. It changed the game on all these cars when they went from a carburetor that basically got them so far with emissions and everything they were trying to do. These were superior, these fuel injection systems. I'm not talking just about this. I'm talking about the OEM manufacturers, GM, Ford especially. Now, this is probably antiquated compared to your later model multi-port fuel injection systems, obviously. And now you have direct port fuel injection on a lot of your more modern engines. But that's kind of, when you hear about sequential, it's still kind of like a multi-port. You have an injector for every cylinder. I believe it's related to when the intake valve opens, that's when it fires. I can't tell you, I'm not going to sit here and try to lie and make up stuff about multi-port versus sequential. But going back to what is best for you? Is it the carburetor? Is it the TBI, the Sniper, or the FiTech? Or is it the multi-port? What is your choice? So let me know. I'm going to try to do the poll. Let me know.